Hello and welcome to State of Play on Mint Press News, a bi-weekly geopolitical news show hosted by myself, Greg Stoker. And after nearly 2 weeks since the collapse of the Assad government, the shifting regional political and military dynamics have become somewhat more clear. Hezbollah and the resistance in Gaza are isolated, so the saying goes. The Palestinian Authority is arresting suspected militants, as they call it, in the West Bank. I believe their actual term is outlaws. On behalf of the Israeli state, the IDF has expanded their military presence in Syria and also pretty much destroyed the entire military infrastructure of the incoming Syrian transitional government. The IDF has expanded, past the Golan Heights into almost up to the suburbs of Damascus. Last time I checked the map, it's not quite there, but in order to arguably annex more land and cut the supply lines of the axis of resistance. And look, if you can't create a buffer zone and do a land grab in Lebanon, may as well take advantage and do it in Syria. So for those interested in Palestinian self-determination, this may seem bleak. These past 2 weeks have been emotional and crazy, but these circumstances are perhaps not as hopeless as they appear. So I'm glad you're joining us tonight on State of Play with Jon Elmer of Electronic Intifada to discuss why these despairing ideations may somewhat miss the mark. And he probably doesn't need an introduction to much of this audience, but Jon Elmer is a Canadian writer and photojournalist specializing in the Middle East and Canadian foreign and military policy. He's lived and reported extensively from the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and covering such topics as obviously the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the disengagement and siege on the Gaza Strip, the sanctions regime and factional strife in Gaza. And he's currently, of course, at the Electronic Intifada. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
So there's obviously a number of things we want to cover. The PA's escalating collaboration with the occupation. How viable is a ceasefire in Gaza? What is the state of the resistance in Gaza? Because, of course, the focus has been taken off of Gaza for like a minute because there was the assault on Lebanon and now the government change in Syria and the expanding occupation of the IDF into Syria. But first, actually, Syria itself. It's just about as divisive an issue as I recall back in like the early 2010s. And I really wasn't even plugged into the situation in Palestine at that time. I was still in the military, and it was actually divisive in military circles because, there was this plan to overthrow Assad. What was going to come through it? It would stymie Iran and Russia's plans in the region, but like, was it really worth it? What's going to come out of it? Anyways, I'm just saying, even in my circles, it's very divisive. And within the pro-Palestine movement, it's definitely been a hot issue.
Yeah, it was devastating. I mean, the original Syria dirty war, in a lot of ways, dismantled the Palestine solidarity movement that had been built up throughout the Second Intifada into the BDS campaign. It was a very divisive a time. And I'm interested to hear that you had the same experience in the military, because the Americans, went in really hard supporting some pretty nefarious characters during the Syrian uprising. And I can imagine it being divisive within the American military as well, although they, that CIA plan put $1 billion a year, not including the amount of money that the Qataris and the Saudis put into that war. And of course, drew in Hezbollah and Iran and made it essentially a proxy war from that point on. And the collapse of Syria was astonishing. I think it's very difficult to find a political parallel to analogy to the swiftness with which the Syrian government collapsed. Of course, the government had been hollowed out, and with 2020 hindsight, you can make statements like that and see how that's obviously true. I mean, there was virtually, literally not a shot fired in defense of the regime. I don't think anybody saw that coming. Of course, I think it makes a certain amount of sense when you look at it in the framework of the ceasefire in Lebanon that effectively froze Hezbollah in their positions, and it was an opportunistic moment for HTS to move from the countryside in Idlib into Aleppo. And then I think once they started pushing on the doors in Aleppo and how easy that fell, they started moving down the highway, and one thing led to another, and barely had time to react to events, and it was over. So at least the end of the beginning, if you could put it that way, because I think there's still many chapters to be written about the Syrian civil war.
Absolutely. And yeah, when they took Aleppo, my first instinct was, okay, they're going to conduct a tactical withdrawal, reinforced, because they've been demilitarized after the Astana agreement. They demobilized a lot. But still, they had a conscript military, but it was still significant, and they had, you know, like heavy weapons, air support from the Russians and their own air force, presumably intelligence support from both Iran and Russia as well, and military advisors and everything else, and did not expect that to happen at all. It seems like there were stand down orders given by certain commanders. Perhaps payments had been made. We're, again, as you said, we're really not going to know. And there's, a mix of elation and trepidation about what the incoming government will be, because of Jelani's problematic past. He's literally styled himself as a Zelensky 2.0, down to like the beard and the clothing and stuff like that. So he's definitely playing for Western support. And I guess what's troubling for a lot of people concerned with the Palestinian resistance would be his stance on disallowing any camps or armed groups, Palestinian groups, to operate in southern Syria, in that part of Syria. Also, he seeks to normalize with Israel. And apparently, I've heard rumors, I don't know if this is true or not, that there was clashes with the PFLP and HTS forces as well.
Yeah, PFLP GC particularly have a strong base allied with the Syrian regime. Yeah, the early stages of this don't look good in terms of the resistance trajectory. Jolani's history is well known. They never attacked Israel. They've never fired a shot in anger at Israel. I mean, I think it is a lot to ask for the new government to defend the Golan within hours of taking over the government. But their response to that has been peace gestures to Israel that's swallowing up huge chunks of strategic territory. The high points, the plateau, the Golan Plateau, is significant strategic natural barrier between the countries. For Syria to lose that, for the Arab world to lose that to the Israelis, is strategically very significant, and something that Israel's had their eyes on for, basically the entire existence of the state, in order to protect the lower lying state of Israel from invading armies, which is the same dynamic in Lebanon. They're essentially, Israel had to fight uphill to fight in Lebanon and to fight in Syria, which has been, Israel didn't, they took minutes to decide that they were going to gobble up that territory and then use their significant intelligence. It's unclear how much of that intelligence came from the new regime in Syria, but Israel used that opportunity to essentially dismantle, 4 decades worth of military assets that belong to the state of Syria. They don't belong to HTS. They don't belong to Assad. They belong to the Syrian people. And so to have that dismantled in that time frame, just Israel's just acting. There's just no red lines. There's no red lines in any aspect of the way that Israel has carried out this war. I guess maybe you could say that the attack on Iran recently did show certain American influence to not target the critical oil and gas infrastructure to start, an economic collapse. So you
Mhm.
see that the Americans can influence the Israelis, but they don't, and they haven't. And
I will add one caveat to that. I completely agree that they can. It was not like a we're telling you to. I believe, and a lot of my colleagues believe, that we helped facilitate the attack because we watched about 10 uh, strato fortresses, which from the U.S. Air Force, uh, basically turn off their transponders right before the attack. And of course, they're for mid-air refueling,
yeah.
and they use F-35s, and F-35s don't have enough fuel to get from Israel,
Oh
Iran,
yeah,
and
the
back.
Americans were absolutely a
Yeah.
part of that attack. Absolutely.
Mhm.
I'm saying in terms of the targeting, like to
Yes.
have a red line on
Mhm.
Israel on their targeting. That's like the only example that maybe you could find in these last 14 months that any red line the U.S. has put up, Israel just blows right through it. And so it's really devastating in terms of Syrian sovereignty. Syria is an important Arab country that has been dismantled before our eyes in 2 weeks. And obviously, the Assad regime was not popular. People were not willing to fight for it in any place, really, in the country, not even in the Alawite heartland. Did people really fight for it? And so I think that was surprising to see. And again, maybe with 2020 hindsight, you can look back and say, and see the reasons why it wasn't popular and that it hasn't been popular for a long time and was propped up largely by support from Hezbollah on the ground, that fought. Hezbollah fought with their people, with Lebanese and Syrian fighters, spilt a lot of blood in those areas around the Golan and Qusair. Those were serious battles back a decade ago. To see them, the Israeli tanks, just roll into those communities without a shot fired, I think it's been, I'm sure, devastating to see for people who fought, gave their lives to protect against this. At the HTS has done, Jolani's done a lot to try to moderate himself, but he was fighting an openly sectarian war, and that was their raison d'etre for the entire Syrian civil war. So people in Lebanon the Shia of Lebanon were fighting for their own communities. They weren't like foreign mercenaries going abroad. It was, a sectarian movement that was killing Shia because they were Shia, and those communities defended themselves. Hezbollah, if anything, Hezbollah was pushed into the Syrian civil war by its rank and file fighters who were going to fight without, they were going to go on their own, freelance fighting, because it's their villages. It was their villages that were being shelled by these Takfiri jihadists who wanted to wipe out entire communities and had a record of doing that. And so Hezbollah, in many ways, joined the war in order to keep the organization unified, because their rank and file wanted to join the war. So it wasn't like a foreign mercenary type involvement. It was a real fear that this kind of group and this kind of ideology was going to spread throughout the Middle East. And of course, and then ISIS did that, and
Mhm.
people saw what actually, that was within a few years, how that ideology operates. And Jolani, of course, split from that ideology, and even as far back as 2015, during the split, he was very clear on their revolutionary praxis being a nationalist one and not the kind of caliphate-based ISIS, um, you know, pan Islamic caliphate. So Jolani has been, in some senses, moderating his position for a number of years, but I think people are legitimately afraid in Syria what this regime, this new order, if it exists, portends for the multi-ethnic, multi-religious breakdown of the state of Syria, which, for whatever its other flaws, the Assad government and the Ba'ath Party itself was, multi-denominational in that sense. So I think there's a lot of fear that's justified.
Yeah, one thing I will say about Jelani, though, a lot of these ex Al Qaeda guys or ex Islamic State guys, that when they try to, I guess we can say, go legit, they do a political pivot and try to court outside backing. We have plenty of examples of former Islamic State commanders uh, becoming assets. The BBC World pretty much proved that an ex Al Qaeda guy was being used by Western intelligence to, subvert and fight the Houthi government, which we definitely do not support. So
Absolutely.
there's some of that there is hope that he will moderate his behavior in order to ingratiate himself to Western powers, Turkish influence, policy objectives. And the real question and the real concern is, like, will his political ambitions be shared by the rank and file, many of whom are foreign fighters?
Absolutely, and the number of groups alone in Syria just dozens and dozens of groups that, in many ways, HTS fought harder against those groups than they even did against Assad's government. The infighting in that civil war and the groups. I mean, it wasn't HTS ultimately that took Damascus. It was the Southern Operations Room groups of the Free Syrian Army, the U.S.-backed elements that saw, once the highway from Homs and Hama was collapsing, that they're the ones who actually moved into Damascus when they realized that there was no opposition. So there's a lot of question marks in Syria. And I think there's a lot of very debased infighting amongst the left and amongst people who are fighting from keyboards in safe countries about the reality of the struggle that people in the Middle East participated in very deeply throughout the civil war and paid enormous prices on both sides, on all sides of that conflict. Hezbollah lost hundreds and hundreds of fighters from those communities that are on the border that moved across to defend, like I said, shelling that was coming into their own families. Hezbollah was in a position where they had to defend themselves. They couldn't allow what was happening, especially at a time when it was so American-backed. The designs to dismantle the corridor between Iran, Syria, and Lebanon was very much an Israeli-American strategic goal. And so that there's a lot of questions about Syria still that certainly have not been, put to rest by some diplomatic statements by HTS at this point, and how this will all shake out in individual communities in Syria is certainly, there's a lot to be answered there.
Right. Just so you guys are tracking, a lot of what Iran has done within the region and how they've established the axis of resistance was due to Western interventionism. Because after Afghanistan, and of course, the Iranian government wasn't sad to see Saddam go, but they knew they were next on the target deck. So that's why they started getting involved in the war in Iraq, trying to bog down the Americans, for their own self-preservation. They've kind of created this network of influence. And what we're talking about, the axis of resistance, one of the big narratives and a lot of the consternation that happened after Assad fell, even though he was deeply problematic, he was seen kind of like as the lesser of two evils, though. A lot of people on the left see him as not necessarily like a bulwark because he was like super pro resistance, but just because he was a bulwark against Western imperialist policy objectives within West Asia. Now that he's gone, the people are saying Hezbollah is totally isolated. They can't get weapons or intelligence support or anything anymore. Same with what's happening in Palestine. I just know from my own experience with this kind of stuff when I was in special operations, that's just really not how it works. I mean, yes, they're going to have to reorganize and reorient their entire approach in the region, but isolation is not really something that exists in the 21st century like that. Just because you cut off a trade lane doesn't mean it's impossible.
No, certainly not. I mean, they have shipping lanes, they have they have airport access in Lebanon. And in terms of Gaza, Gaza's been sealed off as much as any country in known history, essentially for 20 years, for an entire generation. There's been a full naval blockade, literally fenced in like a prison. And so, cutting off the loss of Syria in terms of practical connection to Gaza it's virtually non-existent. The last actual Syrian, say, weapons transfers to the Palestinians, you're going back into the 20th century for that. The story, and we were 440 days into watching Palestinians defend themselves almost exclusively with homemade weapons, with weapons that are made in Gaza. And that was a strategic decision made by the leadership to have an indigenous manufacturing base, which has proven itself, to withstand both the blockade, but also to be able to carry out a 14-month war where you're not dependent on these shipments. And the same could be said in a lot of ways for Hezbollah, because for the last 14 months, the Syrian airspace was not a Hezbollah asset. Hezbollah was not transporting large convoys of weapons into Lebanon over these past 14 months. Israel has had basically total control of their airspace and hit them constantly. They hit the Iranian intelligence advisors that you were talking about. They're constantly hitting the missile factories, the scientific labs. They even, to the point where just before the government fell, Israel carried out a night raid into one of these missile factories and dismantled it. It kind of didn't really make the news because there was so much happening at that time. And Syria was kind of always, the fourth or fifth most important story to cover. And Assad never said anything because Assad's government has been hollowed out. And so even rhetorical support or defending themselves against these Israeli attacks weren't really happening. And I think that HTS, they saw that. They saw that the regime wasn't even able to defend themselves against these isolated raids by Israel. And in Idlib province, HTS had been setting up and preparing for this. They're not just a ragtag militia. They have spent the better part of the last decade institutionalizing their authority, creating governance apparatuses, creating a military college, training their forces, tweaking their doctrine to separate themselves and make a practical, the Al-Qaeda branch that they come from, the ideology needed to be, the Al-Qaeda ideology needed to be adapted to a national liberation struggle, because the Al-Qaeda ideology was, again, pan-Islamic and
transnational.
And so it didn't work. It actually wasn't convincing to people on the ground in Syria. And so there is a lot of talk about whether distancing himself from Al-Qaeda was fake. But I don't think that's true. I mean, I think that his roots are obviously within that movement, and ultimately that's the belief system. But Jolani has worked to to tweak it, to make it relevant to the local population. And we have the example of Idlib. It definitely wasn't an anarchist paradise in Idlib. They ran a strict government, but not as strict and not as sectarian and not as takfiri as previous iterations. And by the time he gets to Damascus, yeah, he's wearing a suit jacket or a North Face pullover hoodie or whatever, and trying to act like he's a statesman. It's pretty remarkable transformation, and the American media apparatus has seemed to be all in favor of working for this makeover. That CNN interview was pretty remarkable, and there was another one just the
especially
other
when he has
day
a
by the
$10 million bounty on his
Yeah.
head.
Yeah.
So I would say, like, I assume he would fall in line. His political survival depends on it. That's why we're concerned about normalizing with Israel, which is a main policy objective for the United States State Department, who are now in talks with Jelani at this time. So again, coming back to HTS clashing with the PFLP in Syria, I guess people are concerned that they'll completely shut down resistance operations coming out of Syria. Do you think?
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Well, the Syrian, like the PFLP-GC is like an auxiliary part of the Syrian army. Assad trained, there was PFLP-GC pilots in their air force. They were brought into the national structure. There's hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Syria. And for the previous generation of resistance, that was important. The PFLP-GC carried out very significant operations from their bases in Syria. Some of the most important prisoner exchanges in the history of the conflict were PFLP-GC operations that captured Israeli soldiers and exchanged them. The Night of the Gliders was a famous operation where PFLP-GC pilots flew gliders over into an Israeli over the fence into Israel and attacked an Israeli base. And the lead up to the first Intifada, which was a series of military actions that happened in the lead up that sparked the first Intifada, which is known as the Intifada of the Stones, because it was essentially an unarmed uprising with stones and knives. But that uprising, the first Intifada, began with militant actions and ended with militant actions, with armed struggle on both ends of what was known as a nonviolent protest. So Syria historically has played a significant part. But realistically, since the second Intifada, since the sealing off of Gaza, which began during the first Intifada in the 1987 to 1992, by 1992, Gaza is starting to have a barbed wire fence around it. By 2000, it's got a concrete wall around it, and people are not getting in or out of Gaza. There's tunnels into the Sinai, but the roundabout way of shipping weapons from Syria through the Sinai that's logistically a challenging. So there was nothing like a Syrian arms pipeline into Gaza. That's overstated in the last 25 years. It just hasn't been a reality. The most significant arms transfers came from Sudan, and they came through the Sinai, which at a time was controlled by ISIS for a long period of time. The weapons came through the Sinai and from Libya, especially after the collapse of Gaddafi. All of Gaddafi's military stores were looted, and a lot of that material was transferred to Gaza. And then, of course, like what I said, since then, since the second Intifada, the Palestinians have had a concerted strategic decision to build their own weaponry, to use unexploded ordnance, repurpose the TNT, and make their own clones of, famously successful, useful Soviet weapons like the RPG, rather than attempting to smuggle with great difficulty weapon systems like the Cornet, or larger anti-tank systems that actually aren't that useful in the intimate urban warfare that Gaza is. They're a bit cumbersome for moving around and setting up. And so
Also, they draw a lot of attention
they draw a
from
lot of
the air.
attention. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it demonstrably doesn't impact what's going to happen in Gaza at all. Also, to the West Bank, either, I would say.
No, the West Bank
Yeah.
is largely, yeah, like Syria. I mean, but Syria has been for so long, since the civil war started, they have been so internally focused on what's going on in Syria that they weren't able to be a strategic player really in the region. They were being defended and propped up themselves. They weren't in a position to be propping others up. But the role that the Palestinians played within the Assad government was significant. There's no parallel in any other country. In Jordan, they're not in the Air Force. In Lebanon, they can't even work in most jobs in Lebanon. Whereas in Syria, they were being trained as pilots, and they were running, battalion level leadership within the military. So that loss of sovereignty itself is devastating, but in terms of actual practical, like what it will mean by number of guns, number of materiel entering Gaza or the West Bank, um, it's not clear that there's going to be any impact on that. For Hezbollah, it's a little bit different because there was an overland route, and Hezbollah fighters would leave through that overland route and train in Iran and do schooling in like military school and religious school in Iran. That was an important point. But again, they have airplanes. There's not a naval blockade on Lebanon. So they will just adapt. They'll adapt the situation. And for the past 14 months, those weapons shipments were bombed by Israel and destroyed. And it was not a lucrative system because they would lose large swaths of material and men. Um, Hezbollah forces coming across the border into Syria were hammered and made it
Yeah.
not something that Hezbollah was doing because it wasn't worth the risk of them getting picked off. So things have changed in the last, they've really changed in the last 15 months, but in the last 20 years, the situation for Palestinians and the role of Syria, the Assad government had so many opportunities to take a different approach than what they took. Of course, as Americans and Canadians, our primary focus and responsibility should be on the role that our governments played in that
Mhm.
civil war, which was a very dirty part of that civil war. And that needs to be, and that should be why people in North America care about the devastation that was wrought on Syria. It was our money
Also,
and
I just have to add, there's a huge chunk of incompetence that went into it as well.
yeah,
Like one of the things that started turning me against like the military service, I was like, what are we doing here now? Like literally, groups that we're funding are fighting other groups that we're funding. Like CIA was funding this group, JACE, Joint Special Operations Command, was funding this group, and then the dynamic, astounding speed at which alliances formed and dissolved
yeah,
in Syria is just uncontrollable.
yeah,
So it was just it
yeah.
was
Whole groups,
absolutely
whole
insane.
groups. Do you
Yeah.
remember that era in the 2016 era? They'd go across the border with all new trucks, all new weapons, all American supplied gear, and
Out
they'd
of
get across
Turkey.
the border, and they would immediately be surrounded by HTS at that time, Jabhat al-Nusra. You know, they had a bunch of different names at the time, but they would just completely subsume the American trained and take all their weapons, and then that group would be their own wing of these groups that already existed. So they didn't even get across the border
Yeah.
before all of it.
So
It's
it
crazy.
it was just horrendous, inhumane, irresponsible foreign policy. Definitely our fault. But again, then again, it doesn't really change the material reality of what's happening in Palestine. Of course, as you mentioned, Hezbollah definitely, but they'll adapt. So going forward, ceasefire. For the first time in like 2 months, we're hearing about ceasefires again. And I'm wondering if it's just because it's the holidays and we're trying to like feel better about everything. But the material reality in Gaza hasn't shifted in the past 3 months. But the ceasefire talks are back for some reason, and there could be a number of factors for that. They have I mean, like Hebrew media and the Israeli government has an opportunity to spin what happened in Lebanon as a victory, and then overthrowing the overthrow of Assad can be spun as a victory. Now, do they have like a political off ramp to actually agree to a ceasefire in Gaza, even though they haven't accomplished any of their military objectives? And bearing in mind that they're ramping up to keep the war going via airstrikes against Yemen. They've been escalating in Yemen as well. So a lot of people are wondering. I'm, of course, incredibly skeptical, as I imagine you are, that this ceasefire thing is actually viable at this stage.
Well, we've just been hooked into this charade that's been going on for this phony ceasefire. Netanyahu just undoes every ceasefire agreement that has been made, going back to Joe Biden talking into his ice cream microphone back in June. They had an agreement back then in principle in place, and Netanyahu just shows up at the last minute and adds conditions to that. And those conditions were devastating conditions. They were to stay in the Philadelphia corridor, which is the corridor along the border with Egypt, which is the only way for Palestinians to exit the Gaza Strip. So to have Israeli control over that territory has been devastating since May when they took it over. But the idea that Israel would stay in that corridor long term is devastating for Palestinians. And so there's no ceasefire agreement that any Palestinian faction or political figure could accept that seals that border off. So, excuse me. So Netanyahu adding that condition, that just torpedoed any ceasefire talks, because nobody could sign that. No Hamas leader, no Palestinian national leader could sign that. And the Netzarim corridor that runs through the center of the Gaza Strip is in many ways even worse, because that's the corridor that Israel wants to set up like what they call a funnel. And they want anyone who's moving back to the north, which is a key demand of Hamas, that people be allowed to return to their homes. Israel wants to create a massive funnel where they disarm and arrest people. And we know what these Israeli arrests are about. They're arresting doctors in the hospitals. They're arresting 13-year-old boys and 85-year-old men. And they're taking them into torture prisons. And the people who are going to these like Sidi Taman torture prisons are turning back as shadows of their former self, and many of them are being murdered. So it's a strong condition that Hamas does not want people being searched and pulled out of the lines on their way back to the north. I mean, the key Hamas conditions have been the same since the beginning. They want an end to the aggression. which is the definition of a ceasefire, but only Israel makes these ceasefires where they get to continue firing and only the other side has to cease fire. But Hamas wants the withdrawal from the corridors. They want Israel to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. You can't occupy Gaza. That was a stipulation made by the United Nations, by the United States, by the Western allies of Israel. Um, and they want to return to their homes in the north. They don't want to be living in tents. They want to live in tents in the temporary. 90% of the population of Gaza, according to the World Health Organization, is living in tents right now. Palestinians want to move back to their homes, and if it means living in tents, they want to live in tents on the properties of their homes. They want to go home. There can't be a ceasefire that keeps people trapped in internally displaced camps the way that this is.
Well,
And
because once
they
they
want reconstruction.
yeah.
There has to be a trajectory for reconstruction that is visible to the whole world and to all Palestinians, or that's not a ceasefire. So if Israel is willing to accept those conditions, Hamas has been flexible about the implementation of those of that agreement, as long as those core factors are in place. Of course, the fifth one is the prisoner exchange. They want their prisoners out of jail in the same way that Israelis want their captives back. Palestinians want their political prisoners back. And so that's the fifth part of that. And Hamas has not wavered on those five conditions, but they are flexible around how it's implemented, how long it takes to implement, having it be a staged release. So these kind of things, this is a typical way that Hamas negotiates. They're very principled. They're speak for the for the Palestinian national project. They're not looking at this for their own sakes or to protect their own skin. They're doing it as representatives of the Palestinian people. And these are major demands that all Palestinians agree upon. And Hamas is not wavering on those. But what they have done, apparently, in the last couple of weeks, is shown some flexibility on the implementation, which seems to allow, at least for the first 45 days of the 60 days, for Israel to remain in the corridors, in the Netzarim corridor and in the Philadelphia corridor, but that as the stages roll out, that they have some guarantees that will ultimately be that Israel will ultimately leave Gaza. And I guess the issue maybe now is Trump. I mean, Trump's a wild card. There's no belief on the Palestinian side that any Joe Biden guarantee by that administration isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Every red line, every time Biden says he's going to do something, from every single example, from the pier to Rafah being a red line, to no buffer zone, no Israeli occupation, all of these things have all just been blown through. But Trump is a wild card, and Trump is a wild card in a lot of ways. And so I think the Israelis, they see this as an opportunity to get the difficult part of the exchange done before Trump comes into office, because he's a bit of a wild card. And then maybe the Palestinians believe that Trump can provide guarantees that they don't believe in from the Biden administration. And that has seemed to give a sort of optimism to these talks. They say it every time, though. I mean, Hamas has always said they're optimistic about these talks. It's not totally clear what this time is different than any of the other 25 times that we believed there was going to be a ceasefire and it just disappears. But I think that these new the new element of a new Trump administration. I mean, Trump is already essentially acting like the president. He's going around, he's traveling to Europe, he's making, threats to that Israel has to end the war. They said there has to be total victory, but unclear what that means. But if he's
Well,
demanding the war end, the war won't end if Israel is in the Netzarim corridor and in the Philadelphia corridor, because the resistance will continue to attack them.
yeah, and they've maintained their operational tempo consistently throughout this entire conflict, and doesn't seem like it's going to stop anytime soon.
No.
There's no reason it would, especially when news articles come out. Like even in Haaretz, they published what was the article from yesterday? A testimony from people, from soldiers on the ground in Netzarim corridor. They killed 200 Palestinians, and
they're just massacring them.
Yeah, and based off of like their intelligence roll up, like only 10 of them were Hamas. But what does that mean anymore?
Yeah, they're like civil servant Hamas, right?
Yeah.
Like they're not even, they're murdering people because nobody in Gaza knows where the red line, Israel operates on this red lines policy where it's like you can't get within a certain distance of their troop positions, but nobody but them knows that. Even their neighboring units don't know it. They're shooting at each other all the time.
Also, they can definitely move their troop positions closer too. So
they're just massacring people that walk too close to positions that the Palestinians don't know exists. It's just murder. It's murder. It doesn't have any military purpose to it whatsoever. And at this point in the war, they're not really fighting the resistance. They're not going into tunnels and trying to find their captives.
No, they stopped doing that a while ago. No, they
Many
never really did it.
They never really did it.
They dressed up some Palestinian men in some uniforms a couple times and sent them into the tunnels, but that's about it.
Yeah, there's not been a concerted effort to map the tunnels and to destroy them. And there definitely has not been a concerted effort to enter the tunnels and try to liberate their prisoners.
Which is actually wild because they have dedicated tunnel clearing and tunnel fighting units that
that have been trained for many years. Yeah, and the alternative is that the infantry aren't allowed into the tunnels. They have an order that says they are not allowed into the tunnels. So if they find a tunnel, they take a selfie with the tunnel and then they call in the Yahalom unit, their special forces engineering unit, and that unit itself, that tunnel unit, they're not actually tunnel fighters. So it's this bizarre situation where the infantry soldiers can't go down, but they send these Yahalom engineering units down, but the engineering units aren't a fighting unit. So then there has to be a secondary fighting unit that comes down. And this just makes layers of ridiculousness and propaganda that you're there fighting. You read any testimony from soldiers, they all say the same thing. We didn't go into tunnels. We thought we were going into tunnels. We thought we were going, their esprit de corps was based on we're saving our friends. We're saving the soldiers that we abandoned on October 7th by being dismantled by Qassam Special Forces unit that invaded their territory and destroyed their military. That they would go back in and rescue the people that they left, and that hasn't been a part of the war. The part of the war is dressing up in women's clothing and tying teddy bears of children that you killed to the front of your bulldozer and knocking down houses and carrying anti-tank mines and wiring them up all throughout entire neighborhoods and blowing them up all at once. Their main goal is just destruction, and they've achieved that. The place, Gaza, is a horror show. It's like you took an eraser and wiped it out. Rafah is basically non-existent. Jabalia, they're coming back now for this is the third major invasion of Jabalia. It's now 70 plus days on, and they're just going street by street from the edges in, destroying houses after house. It's brutal. Sometimes it's just unspeakable. I don't even know. Even though it's my job, I don't know what I'm supposed to say sometimes about this. And they killed 50 people today. They killed 50 people yesterday. they're killing people in their shelters, and then they're burning down the shelters while people are inside the shelters. We're seeing some of the worst crimes in modern history.
Yeah. And it doesn't seem like they're going to stop anytime soon. But, I can't imagine. Well, I guess I don't have their ideology. Just, when I was in the combat unit, just 0% of that even crossed my mind. So it seems like kind of like an alien behavior from my experience. And I don't really know what to say beyond that, except, they're not actually fighting the fighters. So they're going to continue to eat house-born IEDs, explosively formed penetrators along the routes that they have created because they turned the entire battle space into Stalingrad. So they have very predictable channels about where they can drive their vehicles, and they'll continue to take sniper operations for the foreseeable future.
Yeah,
So
and they dug up all the roads. So they dig up all the roads so that you can better plant your EFP and your larger EFP under the dirt. It seems like weren't you guys in Afghanistan doing the exact opposite? Like, weren't you paving all the dirt roads so that they weren't putting the roadside bombs in the roads? And the
yes.
Israelis are doing the exact opposite, tearing up all the ground.
Also, we were trying to build infrastructure because that was part of the whole Hearts and Mind campaign. So they're doing the exact opposite of the U.S. counterinsurgency and doctrine. But so that's Gaza, and I wanted to turn lastly, because the new developing story is the Palestinian Authority. And just so the audience, in case you've missed this story, I'm going to play some footage for you. So this isn't narrated, but this is from Jenin. Clashes have broken out between Palestinian security forces and the resistance fighters. One man has been killed, claimed by group Hamas to be a local resistance fighter. And tensions rose in the Israeli-occupied territory after the PA arrested Hamas-allied fighters as well, and we're hearing clashes of gunfire in the streets. Hamas accused the Fatah Party, which dominates the PA, of targeting their members seen as loyal. And of course, there's the security forces themselves associated with the Palestinian Authority say they are recovering the area from, quote, the control of outlaws. However, many people are seeing them as a collaborator of doing the Israelis dirty work for them.
Absolutely. They're calling this Operation Protectors of the Homeland when it's the resistance fighters that are the protectors of the homeland. The Palestinian Authority security forces, when the Israelis roll in, they roll out. They get radioed by the Israelis that they're coming in, and they hightail it. When settlers, you've heard over these last years, the settler pogroms, basically, where the settlers run rampage through Palestinian villages and burn cars and houses and people as well. The Palestinian Authority security forces, they're out of there. They're not defending the Palestinian people when the settlers come, when the soldiers come, when the actual violence comes. And then now, because the summer was defined by operations by the Israelis in the northern West Bank. So in Jenin, there was multiple week-long invasions that destroyed the infrastructure.
And that's basically what they
fighters.
were. The bulldozers were the main thrust of the Operation Summer Camps, which was a really bold choice for an operation name.
Yeah, in all of the the triangle, what the British used to call the Triangle of Terror in the north of Nablus, Jenin, Tulkarm, Tubas. They've been fighting armed struggle. We would be calling this an intifada at any other time. They've been fighting an armed struggle in the north of the West Bank for 14 months. And so that Operation Summer Camps went in and destroyed all that infrastructure. And now the PA is coming in on the heels of that and shooting teenagers, assassinating the leader of the Jenin Brigades, the most formidable fighting formation defending the camp. And the PA is just not supported by anyone. Like, they are Fatah aligned, but they're not supported by anyone. When the footage coming out of Jenin this week was elderly, community elders, mothers, women coming out and blocking the PA security vehicles from entering the camp, and like banging on their windows, and just real, like, direct action, popular mobilization of respected community members, and the mothers and grandmothers and the elders of the movements, just literally putting their bodies in the way of these PA security forces. And this also seems like it's timed with a Trump. This is the last month before Trump, and the PA wants to show that it's useful, that it's a useful collaborator, comprador regime to the Israelis and to Trump, and that they can take back Gaza and ride into Gaza on the back of an Israeli tank, which is something that Mahmoud Abbas has said that he would do and his party would do for almost 20 years now, since they were expelled from Gaza after attempting to a coup to overthrow the democratically elected government of Hamas in 2006. So this has been brewing for a long time, and there's no honor. There's no honor in this operation by the Palestinian Authority. It's collaborating at the highest order. And it's not successful either. That's the thing. They're not successfully going in and actually rooting out or arresting these fighters. They're killing teenagers on a moped, and assassinating the leader of the Jenin Brigades, who essentially was coming out to negotiate. They just shot him dead as he's negotiating. Like, just really dirty actions that don't advance Palestinian sovereignty in any way. And just further divide, or act in as exactly like the Israelis do. It's like a revolving door. That's how they do it with arrests. The PA will arrest Palestinians. They'll torture them. They'll get information from them, and then they'll release them. And then the Israelis will come in and arrest them the next, sometimes literally the next day after they're released. And then the Israelis interrogate them based on the information that the Palestinian Authority took from them. So and that's also U.S. trained. Keith Dayton, the Marine Corps general, was part of the training of that force. They trained them in Jordan in order to essentially figure out a way, because in normal security, the way security worked was Palestinian police would police the community that they lived in. But Dayton, under the U.S. plan, what they do is they bring them to Jordan, train them in Jordan, and then they deploy them in cities that they don't live in, when they wear masks. And so just, you can see there's just no legitimacy for that. No Palestinian family feels secure because of the Palestinian Authority security forces. Whereas the resistance is very, very popular. And you could see that after summer camps. As soon as the media went in to talk to people, people said, we don't care. They think that if they tear up our roads, we won't support the resistance. We support the resistance A to Z. That's what they said. And they interviewed the kids, like, well, you're not in school. Does this bother you that you're not in school? And the kids are like, no, as long as the fighters are fine. Places like Jenin have 100-year history of resistance. You're not going to break that through a collaborator regime that's not even any good at fighting. Well,
it seems like it's good at radicalizing future fighters if they're arbitrarily shooting kids on mopeds.
Yeah, that's what it does. That's all it does. It gives them no legitimacy. And if you're going to be a security force for the Palestinians under occupation, you need to be able to be working with the Palestinian people. You can't be an implant from the Israelis. That'll never work. And that's why it doesn't work for the Palestinian Authority. And that's why they're a failure, because they are collaborators.
Yeah. And it seems like a lot of things, their days are eventually going to be numbered. They're only propped up by Israeli and U.S. support.
Yeah.
So, well, I mean, thanks so much for taking the time. We did the roundtable on the three hotspots. Now that the emotions around Syria have kind of like cooled down within the movement, we can take a breath and realize that yes, things are absolutely horrific in Gaza, but of course, that's not necessarily indicative of how resistance works, especially in a place as that's under an apartheid occupation, and getting weapons, material, and intelligence support into that place in the first place isn't really going to be affected too much, with the exception of the Palestinians operating in Syria, by the regime change.
Yeah, we need to be very careful making statements like that this is the end of the resistance or the end of these kind of statements like Syria is the backbone, as if if you lose your backbone, you're dead. So that is not the case. That's not the right framing for this, and it does a disservice to the resistance to make it that simplistic.
And
It's a
also,
devastating loss of sovereignty for a major Arab country, and it's a terrifying, future unless things can change. It's a terrifying future, but the resistance is not defeated by the fall of Assad.
yeah, and also the resistance was born organically, not at the behest of Iran, like the U.S. media wants to frame it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Jon Elmer, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time this close to the holidays. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
All right, y'all. This has been State of Play on Mint Press News. We're going to do one more episode before the holidays. That's next Monday. I'm going to be interviewing former four-star general Dennis Leitch about the recruiting crisis in America and how it's not getting fixed. So, hope to see you next Monday, and we're out.